All right, everyone, welcome back. It is a Water, Wetlands, and Watershed seminar for November 4th, 2020. Thank you for coming out today. The world continues to swirl around us, and we'll try to stay focused and attentive to everything that we need to do to promote our democratic institutions. But in the meantime, we also have to remember that water continues to flow downhill and be processed through ecosystems, and critical for all of us to remain alive, that we have that resource and live to fight another day. With that, I'm going to introduce our speaker for the day, Charles Scaife. Charles, I forgot to ask you if I'm saying that right. Scaife is correct?
You got it.
So Charles Scaife is a PhD candidate of environmental sciences at the University of Virginia and also a John A. Knauss Marine Policy Fellow at the U.S. Department of Energy in Washington, D.C. It's where he's calling from today. He has conducted extensive research across Appalachia in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service, the Coweeta Hydrologic Laboratory, and the Coweeta Long-Term Ecological Research Site. At DOE, he examines how his research, which quantifies the impacts of changing forests on water resources, impacts our energy systems. So you've heard probably a lot about food, energy, and water, and here we're going to talk a lot about this energy-water connection. And Charles also received a master's degree in geography and bachelor's of environmental sciences with a minor in marine sciences from UNC at Chapel Hill. So Charles, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thanks everyone. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see beautiful pictures and not just me. All right, can I get a confirmation that my screen is up and you're seeing slides?
It is not up. We do not see it.
Okay, let me share my screen first.
No worries. There we go. Right. Coming through now. Yep, we got you.
Perfect. All right, yeah. Thanks again for inviting me and for the opportunity to talk to you all about some of the work that I've been doing. It's really an honor to be speaking here today and from the comfort of my own bedroom in Washington, D.C. I think, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the moment that we're all in and the anxiety that I think many of us are probably feeling, and that it's incredibly distracting. And I've been having trouble focusing in the past few days and even today, but I hope that at least for this hour or so, we can all just take a collective breath and, just kind of roll with the science for now, and then get back to the obsessive checking of Twitter or news later. So
that's right. Take 1 hour break and you'll watch the tallies when we get back after the questions for Charles. So
exactly. So anyway, I'll go ahead and start my presentation after that. Can you guys see my mouse on the slide moving?
I do not see it moving.
That is totally fine. Then I will just be very descriptive in my slides. So today's talk is basically on my dissertation, but on sort of broader work that I've been doing over the past few years. It's really drawing on principles of ecology and hydrology and really trying to understand how they interact across scales. But I think it's really important, before we do any of that, to really think about why we care about ecology and hydrology. I think one really important reason is that, water resources are really vital to us, right? And forests and grasslands that comprise watersheds that supply our water resources can provide some of the highest quality water in the country. And that on Forest Service lands alone, upwards of 60 million Americans get their drinking water supply. So this picture on the right here is of the RHESSys Reservoir in Yosemite National Park. It's a reservoir situated in a forested basin. And this reservoir feeds the Bay Area, its water supply. But one thing we need to consider is that these forests are changing, right? And that they're changing in response to things like climate change. So over the past decade or so, we've seen rises in temperature. We've even seen oscillations in precipitation. So that middle figure there is showing you sort of the dry seasons towards the bottom, and then oscillating towards wet at the top. And these oscillations are becoming greater and longer. And so we're seeing, the impacts of multiple droughts. And we often think about the impacts of climate change occurring in places like California, where they're really visible, right? Where fire is really visible, especially this year. But I want to draw your attention to the picture. So in Southern Appalachia in 2016, it was a dry year and these forests caught fire. And this is one of the wettest regions in the East Coast, basically. And, these persistent droughts are having impacts on the landscape. But it's not just climate change that's changing the vegetation of this landscape that's important for our water resources. We're also seeing changes just due to things like pests or natural succession. So the figure I'm showing here is the year on the x-axis, and basically the importance value or how prevalent these species are on the y-axis. And what we see is that over time, we've seen this decline across Appalachia in chestnuts and in hemlock, particularly in Southern Appalachia, to the point where these species can't really even be found in mature stages in our forest. And we're also seeing the rise in species like maple as well. And so, with this ecosystem dynamic, we're seeing that it's accelerating. And, I really want to bring this, I want to highlight that, the ecosystem is really dynamic in this particular part of the country, but that it's important that we bring it back to hydrology and what that means for hydrology. So as many of you know, right, there's this linkage between precipitation and streamflow, right? The water that falls on the land surface makes it to the stream. But that we also need to think about how that water falling on the land surface might traverse from the upslope down to the stream and what it meets along that path, right? And what it meets is this vegetation, is this ecosystem. And so the dynamics are really important for drawing connections between precipitation and streamflow. So we need to understand how this vegetation on the landscape is changing with response to climate, to temperature, and to other disturbances like pests. So, the big question for this talk and for my research is, how does dynamic vegetation response regulate streamflow? Now, there's been a lot of work looking at how vegetation regulates streamflow, particularly baseflow. But, I want to talk today about stormflow, because stormflow in these human systems could make upwards of 20% of the flow that we see in streams. So the focus of today's talk will be the Coweeta Hydrologic Laboratory. It's located in Southwest North Carolina. There's a little tiny star there to show you where it is. And the Coweeta Basin is sort of outlined in this larger figure here. It's a little bit hard to see the ridges, but we're sort of looking down towards the outlet, which is the far area in the center of that picture. Now, this research site is comprised of many sub-catchments where experiments have been conducted, like clear cuts shown in the lower right-hand corner, and the replanting of things like white pine and evergreen species. So if we go back to that larger figure, you can see there's some green spots. This is a fall picture, but there's some really bright green spots, and those are where the evergreen pines are. And the whole purpose is to understand how vegetation impacts streamflow. But these forests are really biodiverse. And in that upper right-hand picture, you can see that the canopy here is multi-layered. So there's a deciduous overstory that loses its leaves during the winter time. And there is an understory that's evergreen. So it's using water all year round. And so all of these will have sort of implications, right, on streamflow and particularly storm flow, which we'll talk about today. It's worth noting that hydrologic research has been conducted at Coweeta for nearly 100 years, and that this connection between vegetation and streamflow and baseflow in particular is not really new. So this is a model from Hewlett and Hibbert in 1967 showing the importance of subsurface flow, so the flow beneath in the soil, basically, and its contributions to streamflow. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm really interested in how the vegetation is interacting with this subsurface flow. And so we really want to think about, not just what's happening in sort of the deeper arrows here, but maybe even in these more shallow areas and arrows. And start to ask the question of, how does vegetation interact with these subsurface flows? But there is this prevailing paradigm that's growing in hydrology called the two water worlds. And it's worth noting here because the two water worlds kind of argues the opposite, right? That the pool of water that is going to the stream is separate than the pool of water that's being used for vegetation, and that there's not a lot of interaction here. Now, I'm not going to go into this figure on the left here. It's, we can talk about it in the Q&A, but the idea here is that we can measure these two separate pools of water that are being used. But, what I was talking about earlier was that, we really want to see how vegetation interact with water flowing to the stream. But, according to the two water worlds, this might not be occurring. So, I want to think about if this even applies. Does the two water worlds apply in human systems? And if it doesn't, can we show that it doesn't? So that's kind of what we'll be getting at today. So the three sort of sub-questions that I'll frame the rest of this talk around are going to be, how do vegetation and climate interactions impact storm flows? So, the water in streams during a storm at the catchment scale. And, do the dominant flow paths contributing to storm flow even have the opportunity to interact with vegetation? Are those flows coming from places in the subsurface where vegetation are rooted? And then finally, we'll look at climate change and ask, how will vegetation-climate interactions buffer or enhance these flow regimes? So looking at the first question, we wanted to take a really sort of simple approach because, again, we're looking at this catchment scale. And we wanted to look at threshold relationships. So threshold relationships are a relationship between storm precipitation and storm discharge, or how much it rains during an event and how much flow there is during an event. And what we find is that when you plot these two against each other, you get this really nice break and slope where it takes some amount of precipitation before you start to see significant discharge come out, significant stream flow come out. And that this relationship is linear once you start to generate flow. Now, what's really important here are the arrows in this diagram, that these thresholds to storm discharge vary with things like potential evapotranspiration, or PET, so a climate variable, or things like antecedent drainage. So how dry was it potentially before it started raining? But also things like subsurface storage. So how much room is there in the soil for storage? And finally, things like bedrock permeability. But one thing I want to point out about this conceptual figure, right, is that vegetation's not really in here. It's not telling us about how vegetation transpiration is impacting threshold dynamics, because this model was built on the assumption that catchments have their own unique threshold and that they don't necessarily vary through time. But our hypothesis is that, these thresholds change with evapotranspiration, producing different thresholds with response to season. So again, we focused at the Coweeta Hydrologic Lab, looking at 3 catchments, so watersheds 14 and watersheds 18, that are sort of on the right-hand side here. And then watersheds 27, which is toward the bottom of that larger figure. Watersheds 14 and watersheds 18 are low elevation catchments. So they receive a little less rainfall than watershed 27, which is a high elevation catchment. And again, we're doing a threshold analysis. And so the appeal is that it's really simple, right? We only have to measure a few variables and it can tell us something about maybe what's happening on the landscape. So we're measuring discharge using V-notched weirs. So that's the picture in the lower left hand. And we're also using soil moisture probes that are buried throughout these catchments. So that's just the picture at the top there on the left is just a picture of the box that the data logger basically for the probes that are buried below. And then we're also using rainfall gauges. So those are the black triangles in that big picture that are sort of spread throughout the catchment. And again, we have to use many different rain gauges because the rainfall varies across this elevation gradient. So to do this type of threshold analysis, it's relatively simple, I think. We just need to define what a storm even is. So, we define it based on a rainfall depth. So let's say, an event starts whenever rainfall is 5 millimeters or greater, whenever rainfall intensity is some millimeters per hour, and then this storm event is going to end whenever Quickflow returns to 0, whenever that storm flow returns to 0. So I'll use Quickflow and storm flow kind of interchangeably here, but they're the same. And once we do that, then we just need to isolate these thresholds. So what we did was we used soil moisture to tell us something about how dry it was before it started raining. So we created an antecedent soil moisture index that takes our soil moisture measurements and integrates it so it converts from a % soil moisture to a millimeters of depth soil moisture. So what we get is the ability to sort of add this antecedent soil moisture index, or ASI, plus the total precipitation, and then plot that against the total Quickflow, revealing a sort of better threshold relationship. Then we use a piecewise linear regression to just determine it quantitatively. A lot of previous papers kind of eyeball it and they're like, oh yeah, 190 millimeters, that sounds about right. But because we want to look at individual years over lots of data, we need to develop a quantitative way of doing this. So looking across all 3 of our catchments, whenever we did a threshold analysis, we found that when we used longer data sets, so in watershed 18 and watershed 27, we had weaker relationships. So you can see the R-square values in red here. Watersheds 14 had a stronger relationship and only 2 years of data. So, what this might suggest is that there's a lot of variability in this data when we look at 15 years of precipitation, soil moisture, and flow data. And so we really need to start teasing out that interannual variability to really get at what's happening within each individual year. So in this next figure, I'm just showing watershed 18, but we did this analysis as well for watershed 27. And what we've done is we've taken all of the storms that we computed for watershed 18, in this case, divided them into dormant season, so whenever the leaves are off, and growing season, whenever the leaves are on. And the dashed vertical lines here represent the threshold computed within an individual season. So every vertical line on the right-hand graph is an individual summer. And the colors are coordinated by how much relative rainfall there was. So red being a drier summer and blue being a wetter summer. And so I think one of the things I hope that jumps out to you all is that there's this really pretty rainbow, right? That forms in the growing season, but that there's not the same pattern during the dormant season. And what this really pretty rainbow during the growing season is telling us is that during really dry summers, it takes less precipitation for storm flow to be produced. I'm gonna let that sink in because I know it sounds probably reversed, and we're gonna talk about it a little bit more. So I can take this really pretty rainbow and I can actually plot it, right? So now on the x-axis, we have total seasonal rainfall from dry, which were those red vertical lines in the previous figure, to wet, which were the blue vertical dashed lines, and then the threshold value. And what we see is that there's a strong relationship and a significant relationship in both watershed 18 and watershed 27, but only during the growing season. So again, we're looking for this vegetation signal, and the vegetation is on in one season and off in the other. And because we see this organized relationship in the growing season, it's suggesting that the transpiration is playing a role in structuring when we see storm flow. I want to reiterate here, though, that what we're seeing is that during wet growing seasons, we have a higher threshold to quick flow response. So what does that actually mean? So the idea that we sort of developed to explain this was that the capacity of the ecosystem to transpire was impacting where the threshold was occurring. So that there was less leakage during a wet summer, so vegetation's really happy, it's transpiring along, and it's using all of the water that's available to it. Versus during the dry or drought seasons, where there might be damage to the xylem, they may have senesced or cut off roots, or done the same to leaves, and so they may not be as healthy. It's these periods where we think that the system might be leakier and that it is now losing water. It's no longer using it for transpiration, and so it takes so that the storm flow threshold is lower. Okay, I'm gonna pause there and switch from sort of figures to showing a conceptual diagram, because I think this is probably the easiest way to describe this maybe counterintuitive wet high thresholds, dry low thresholds scenario. So the first thing I want to remind you is that we controlled for antecedent conditions, right? So when we look at this storm hydrograph here, we have some antecedent condition, which is that blue dashed line on the left. And we have some rainfall, which are these blue bars coming from the top. That rainfall causes the stream flow, so that blue dashed line, to increase. It reaches some peak, and then the stream flow starts to decrease over time. Now, the area under that curve could be divided between storm flow and base flow. And we can impose some sort of transpiration signal over it, right? So we can say, okay, when it rained, transpiration was lower, it was cloudy, the leaves were wet. When it stopped raining, transpiration kicked back on. It's starting to use water, it's starting to actively draw down the stream flow. And we're seeing that reduction, that blue dash line starting to come down. And this is a normal year or a wet year whenever things are happy and healthy. Okay, let's now look at the dry scenario. So we have the exact same initial conditions. We have the exact same precipitation event. All we've done is we've reduced the transpiration. So what we would expect to find in this case is increased storm flow. So a potential rise in the peak and even differences in the recessional limb. Now, I want to draw your attention to the recessional limb in particular, because we're actually going to come back to that and actually analyze these recession limbs between these sort of transpiration scenarios between high and low transpiration. So, this work is showing, right, that like there's this connection between vegetation and stream flow, or it's at least hypothesizing that there is. But as I mentioned before, right, there's this paradigm that says that, no, these are actually two separate things. There's plant water and then there's stream water. But again, I think it's really important in these humid systems that, maybe we dive into these two water worlds a little bit more and try to explore, how this applies here or if it does apply here. And so, what we wanted to do next was look at where the water is coming from that's going into the stream. Because if the water's coming from deeper sources, so groundwater flow or bedrock flow even in this diagram, there's going to be little opportunity for vegetation to interact with that water that's flowing to the stream. However, if it's flowing from the unsaturated zone, so that unsaturated flow, where most of the root mass sits for a lot of these trees, then there could be greater opportunity for interaction. So the research question that we'll dive into next is, do the dominant flow paths contributing to storm flows have the opportunity to interact with vegetation? So this is going to require us to dive a little bit deeper into this threshold analysis and ask ourselves, what's happening in the subsurface? So to do this, we used hourly data. And this required us to sort of move around which watersheds we were incorporating into our analysis based on data availability. So we're actually just going to look at watershed 14 in Coweeta, watersheds 2 in Coweeta, and then we're going to incorporate the Shale Hills CZO or Critical Zone Observatory in central Pennsylvania, so another Appalachian site. And again, this analysis is really simple, right? We're going to look at discharge and we're going to look at rainfall and soil moisture and try to isolate threshold relationships that we saw in the previous paper. So we're going to use the same total precipitation and the same antecedent soil moisture index, or ASI, and try to isolate these threshold events. But we're going to go one step further with our groundwater data and our soil moisture data to ask what's happening in the subsurface during these storm events, particularly the storm events that are above the threshold. And, is there some unique pattern within sort of the blob of mess of soil moisture and groundwater that can explain where the water is coming from in the stream flow? So we're going to look at some figures too of soil moisture plotted against groundwater and try to make sense of these blobs. So as I mentioned, we first just did our standard threshold analysis that we did before, except we're using hourly data here. So again, x-axis is how much it rained during an event, so gross precipitation or gross P, and then how dry was it before it started raining, or antecedent soil moisture index, ASI. What we found was that across all of our watersheds, we developed threshold relationships, so good. All of our thresholds were different, and all of the slopes of the lines fit to data above the threshold were different. So what this is signifying, right, is that there could be different processes contributing to flow or contributing to the amount of quick flow that's coming out of these catchments. So now we're going to look at what's happening in the subsurface during these events. So first, if we just take soil moisture and plot that on the x-axis, and then plot quick flow on the y-axis, we can see that across all of our sites, we have different patterns, but for the most part, they are sort of nonlinear, right? As soil moisture wets up, quick flow starts to increase. There is some variability around this increase, but nevertheless, it starts to increase. The story is a little different for groundwater. So let me just orient you really quick to these figures. So on the x-axis, if we're further to the left on those figures, the groundwater is deeper, or the groundwater level is deeper. And then if we're further to the right on these axes, then the groundwater level is higher or closer to the surface. So in watershed 2, we seem to have this relationship where there could be a threshold potentially at which groundwater starts to contribute to quick flow. However, in watershed 14, it looks like this could be non-linear or non-unique, or there may even be no relationship. And then finally, at the Shale Hills CZO, it seems to be almost entirely dominated by groundwater, where as the groundwater level reaches the surface, we start to generate quick flow rapidly. But what happens whenever we plot soil moisture and groundwater against one another to see how they co-vary? So again, to orient you to these figures, we now have soil moisture on the x-axis. So towards the left is dry soil moisture, and towards the right is really wet soil moisture. On the y-axis, we have groundwater. So again, towards the top is higher groundwater levels, and then towards the bottom is lower groundwater levels. And the colors here represent our highest, the top 1% of quick flow. So when we're above the threshold and generating rapid flow. But I think it's good to step back from these figures and just to look at the shapes, because they're all really different, right? So in watershed 2, we have this point cloud that curves upward. So we're seeing almost a decoupled system whenever soil moisture is drier, so towards the left, and groundwater is deeper, so towards the bottom. And as it starts to wet up, we see in watershed 2 this rise. So soil moisture is rising and groundwater is rising, and they're both contributing to these really high flows. It's different in watershed 14, though, in the middle. Here, we don't see the variables co-vary in the same way, right? We only see the top % of quick flows occur whenever soil moisture is high, but not necessarily in relation at all to sort of groundwater. So, it sort of follows the high soil moisture front. At the Shale Hills CZO, however, it's the opposite, right? It's almost entirely groundwater dominated, in which it's not until the groundwater starts to get to the surface that we see these top 1% of quick flows, or until we see high quick flow. So, what do these point clouds tell us about the indicators of flow? So I would argue that, in watershed 2, this co-rising of soil moisture and groundwater to generate quick flow is telling us that sources of flow may be from both pools of water. And I'll remind you that that soil moisture zone, that shallow soil moisture zone, is where most of the root mass sits. And so in watershed 14, where it's almost entirely soil moisture, there's a lot of opportunity here, right, for vegetation to potentially pool at that water that's going to quick flow. However, in places like Shale Hills, it's almost entirely groundwater dominated, right? It's not until groundwater reaches half a meter from the surface that we start to see rapid quick flow. And so maybe there's less of an opportunity for vegetation to interact. I will note that our soil moisture was measured to a half a meter depth. And groundwater in shale hills can reach 400 millimeters from the surface. So there's an interaction actually occurring in shale hills where not only is soil moisture wetting from rainfall from above, but it's also wetting from groundwater from below. And so we start to get an interaction in our measurements there. Okay, so what does this mean then if we go back to our two water worlds? From watershed 14 and to some degree watershed 2, we see that this role that soil moisture plays as an indicator of quick flow hints to us that unsaturated through flow is really important for storm flow generation. And it's this unsaturated through flow in the soil moisture that can interact with vegetation or the root system of vegetation. So as I mentioned before, if plants are interacting with water flowing to the stream, we should see it in the recession limbs of these hydrographs. So, these blue and dashed blue lines should be different whenever plants are pumping water during the summertime and whenever they're not pumping water during the wintertime. And so we tested this with the recession analysis. Now, recession analysis have been historically used for determining basin and aquifer characteristics. And what a recession analysis is you just take a long series of flow data and you plot it on the x-axis. And then you calculate the change in flow over the change in time, and you plot that on the y-axis. And basically, when you fit an equation to the boundary of these point clouds, it tells you something about the aquifer, basically. And the relationship can be described by the equation on the left. So, the equation on the right. The plot on the left is showing you this in log-log space, right? And so if we go back to sort of the equation on the right, alpha is our intercept value and beta or B is our slope value. So we'll dive into that alpha and beta because they become really important, right? So this paper in 2012 uses a recession analysis to show that, the individual storms within these point clouds may be changing through time. So the gray dots in the figure on the left are showing sort of that point cloud, and they fit a curve to the boundary, and they're finding parameter sets similar to historical ways of doing this. But when you start to extract individual storm events, so the colored points in the figure on the left, and you fit a line through those points, you see that the slope is actually steeper looking at these individual storm events, but that they change through time, right? So there's the shift from left to right, the slopes might be changing, and their intercepts might be changing. Now, if you just extract their intercepts, so that alpha value, and you plot them through time, what this paper found was that they actually varied, right? And they used time, or the Julian day, as a proxy for potential evapotranspiration. Okay, so we're talking about alphas here, and I feel like we're kind of losing ourselves in the equation. So I want to bring it back to what does this actually mean in terms of flow, in terms of the recession limb of these hydrographs. So whenever that intercept value is higher, we start to bend our recession, or that, how the stream flow kind of comes down after a storm event, we start to bend that down. So it goes from that black line to the blue dashed line. So just try to keep that in mind as we go through the next couple of slides. So basically we repeated this, right, for watershed 14. We used 30 years of data, conducted a recession analysis, and I'm just showing you some example storms for each of the seasons. And what we can see is that for every season, the storm, the line that's fit through these storms is different than the lines fit through the data itself, or through that point cloud of data, those gray points. And that when we do this for every storm over the 30-year period and extract their alpha values, so the A values, and we plot them through time, we find a sinusoidal relationship. Now, again, this time component is an estimate for PET, or potential evapotranspiration, but potential evapotranspiration is not vegetation transpiration. And vegetation transpiration is really hard to measure, particularly across an entire catchment, right? But what we're interested in is this vegetation transpiration on these alpha values. So we had to model it. So we used the regional hydro-ecological simulation system to give us transpiration across the catchment. Now, I'm not going to go into this slide other than to say that the RHESSys model is a model that produces things like soil moisture. It does carbon and nitrogen cycling, and of course, water cycling. And we used it to basically fill in some of the gaps with regard to transpiration. So when we modeled Streamflow over the 30 years of data and did the same sort of recession analyses and plotted that over both the alpha term and the beta term, we found reasonable overlap between them. So we found similar patterns between the A value and the B value. Now, again, our x-axis is time, a proxy for PET, but not transpiration. So when we look at that alpha value and we plot it against potential evapotranspiration on the right-hand side and against transpiration on the left-hand side, what we find is that they don't form that nice curve that 2012 paper I showed hypothesized. We get blobs, right? But when we look in more depth into these blobs, we find that there's hysteresis occurring, right? So even if we just look at potential evapotranspiration, we see that from January, which is the 1, through December, the 12, the alpha values are changing, right? But then if we look at the transpiration variable, which we're really interested in, we see whenever transpiration turns on in April and May, we start to see a change in that alpha. It starts to become more positive. And it increases throughout the summer before returning in the fall. So if we go back to that conceptual recessional limb of a hydrograph, and we relate that back to this hysteresis that we're seeing in transpiration, we can see that as the growing season kicks in and those alpha values start to become more positive, that our recession limb starts to bend, right? It starts to bend downward towards that blue line. So we're starting to generate less storm flow because it's being consumed by transpiration. Okay, that was a lot. So I'm just gonna pause here to just kind of restate the journey that I've taken you on. So basically, we've talked a lot about precipitation, streamflow, and what happens in between. We have shown that, if we look at thresholds measured at the catchment scale, that transpiration is varying these thresholds during the growing season. And that a lot of the water that's coming out in the stream during storm events is originating, at least at Coweeta, from the shallow soil moisture zone. And that finally, that transpiration has the ability and opportunity to pool from the shallow zone in ways that impact the hydrograph. So I think, we can say that from these 3 papers alone, that dynamic vegetation, there's some indication that dynamic vegetation is regulating storm flow. But I want to bring this back to climate change, right? I started this talk off saying that forests are changing because of changing climate. So, what happens to these relationships that we've talked about when we are, changing the species composition, when temperatures are rising and drought is becoming worse, and there's the potential for fire. So this last portion is ongoing work, but I just want to give you, I guess, a little teaser of some of this work. So, the question here is, under climate change, how will these vegetation-climate interactions buffer or enhance these flow regimes that we've talked about? There's a lot of things we need to consider when we start asking these questions, right? Particularly in Southern Appalachia, where we have many species. So the first is, when we think of consecutive droughts, we need to think about how those droughts impact species differently. So how does a tulip poplar respond to a drought? How does an oak respond to a drought? How do these rising maples, the prevalence of maples is rising throughout these catchments. How do they respond to drought? But then we need to ask the question of okay, they exist in different parts of the landscape. And we need to consider that spatial variation of drought response across an entire catchment. So, tulip poplars might sit closer to the stream, oaks might sit closer to the ridge, and water flowing through that subsurface is going to interact with all of these different species. How does that manifest at the catchment scale? So you can see that it starts to become a really sticky question. But hydrologic models is a way that we can start to get at these tree scale interactions at a catchment scale. But the catch is that hydrologic models don't do any of this. So they don't address species-specific drought response or this non-stationarity in climate vegetation interactions. And so we've got to develop hydrologic models that do so. So what we've done thus far is we've combined a plant hydraulics model. So, how a single tree species responds to stress into an eco-hydrologic modeling framework. So a hydrologic model that can scale that across the catchment using RHESSys. And you can imagine, once we start to understand the forest more holistically and its drought response more holistically, we can start to ask some interesting questions. So I think it's worth going back to RHESSy and thinking about, the purpose of that reservoir is to serve drinking water supply. But what happens when the vegetation on this landscape starts to change, or a fire occurs and the transpiration flux is now gone? But I also, want to say that there are other purposes than just drinking water supply that we can start to ask when we start to think about vegetation and climate interactions. So the other side of this is that, the O'Shaughnessy Dam sits at the end of this reservoir. And the O'Shaughnessy Dam generates electricity for the local area. And so, some of my work at the Department of Energy is thinking about the impact that climate change is having on renewable resources, on renewable energy resources. And so if the watershed in which this reservoir that's creating power starts to change, so the forest is changing, its dynamics are changing, and as a result, storm flow is changing, what happens to our energy? And can we start to build in sort of land management or forest management opportunities to build more resilience, to build fire resilience, or to build resilience against pest, or potentially against succession into maybe less drought resilient species? And start to ask questions at sort of this energy water nexus. So with that, thank you for coming along this journey of talking about this connection between precipitation and streamflow and how ecosystem dynamics might play a role in thinking about how energy could be impacted and how management might be a tool for building resilience. I hope you all learned something. And obviously this was, way beyond just my own work. It was the work of many folks, including collaborators from a multitude of institutions, including the US Forest Service and other universities. Funding for a lot of this work came from the US Forest Service, National Science Foundation, and the Long-Term Ecological Research Network, and obviously from UNC Chapel Hill and from the University of Virginia. And with that, I can take any questions.
Thanks, Charles. Thank you so much for the presentation. You took us from the soil to the landscape to the future of climate change, show you all the way across, and very much appreciated sort of the question framed about this two water worlds and where you can find support or not for it. I think it's been a topic much discussed and either wholeheartedly believed or wholeheartedly disbelieved, like so many things going on in the world. So I appreciate that. We'll open it up to questions. I saw Matt Cohen was on. He may have a question. If you have one, Matt, if not, I can go.
I mean, I do have a question. That was a fantastic seminar, Charles. That was really, really cool. And it's really neat to see the sweep of it. I was interested in all of it, but my question was about your threshold behavior in the watersheds, quick flow behavior getting sort of smaller and smaller storms as the antecedent wetness conditions are reduced, right? So which is kind of a counterintuitive response. And I wondered if you have any incidents of hydrophobic soils in these catchments, because we see in a lot of the coastal plain soils down here is that when they're really dry, they generate overland flow because the waxes and whatnot coat the sand grains, and infiltration is essentially turned off for a little bit. And so I don't know if I don't think it invalidates the inferences, but I wonder if that's a feature of the Coweeta systems.
Yeah, I think, that's a fantastic question. These are forested soils and they're highly conductive. There is almost no overland flow. And if it does occur, it's under the wettest conditions and very close to the stream. These soils don't have a lot of clay. And so they don't tend to generate overland flow or have hydrophobic properties. I will say that, there is a lot of foliage, right, on the ground, and that sometimes that can act to kind of buffer that infiltration to some degree. But I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I want to say it was less than 1% of the rainfall that makes it through the canopy gets trapped in that duff layer and that leaf layer. So that does prevent some infiltration into the soil, but for the most part, everything is going into the soil in these environments.
Great, yeah, that was going to be my follow-up, not just hydrophobicity, but things like storage and leaf litter, or if you have a drought period and you've burned off a bunch of organic matter, do you just change the storage capacity of the soil? But it sounds like you really are finding this reduction in ET as the primary driver of that response.
Yeah, and I think as all good science, right, it generates more questions. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity here to start thinking about how we can validate some of the hypotheses that we laid out related to transpiration and transpiration capacity across these ecosystems. And so thinking about supplementing some of these hypotheses with eddy flux data, basically, trying to understand how transpiration is changing across an ecosystem in response to drought.
Yeah. I have two kind of nerdy questions about the technical stuff, but I see we just had a question pop up from Elliot White on the YouTube. He says, great presentation. Coweeta is a very unique hydrologic setting for the Southeast. What other parts of the country or world are your findings most applicable? So is this just stuck in the CZO site in the Coweeta, or can we you use Hetch-Hetchy as an example? How broadly applicable are your specific findings?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of depends. it depends on, I guess, which part of the finding. I think whenever it comes to the sort of just the broader vegetation climate interactions and the role that they may play on future water resources, I think that's broadly applicable. The work that we did to combine plant hydraulics into a hydrologic modeling framework are something of interest in California. So that was that work that I did to combine those two modeling frameworks was actually funded to do that work out in California, where they're looking at dry chaparral and even sort of systems in the Sierra Nevadas. And so there's a lot of opportunity to explore land management potential to basically create more resilience in water supply. So, one example that's used, I think, commonly out west is like, if we thin forest and build more snowpack, do we have more water later in the summer? Right. But you can start to think through like, okay, that might have some ecological and some hydrological implications if we start changing around our ET fluxes. And so I think some of these vegetation climate interactions and their impacts on flow are very broadly applicable.
Yeah, preaching to the choir here, to the folks that are on the Zoom about what are the effects of forest management on the long-term water resources. So let me ask a bigger question then. When the last part of the talk where you said, put in a plant hydraulics model into an eco-hydrologic model, but the maples or the poplars are down here and this is over here, and already you're working on like the storm flow portion, maybe 20% of the flow. I guess as a broader question, how right do we have to be in characterizing like the ecophysiology or like the eco-biophysics of the system to answer those big questions? Like if you zoomed out and use a big model like a SWOT or even like a water balance model or a VIC or something, can you get the job done? And it's of course interesting, but how right do we have to be biophysically to be right in a management sense?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you. I think the jury's still out, right? I don't know that. I'm trying to think, how do I answer this without like, I don't know.
The answer is that nobody knows, and so you have to get funded to do more research.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that there's a lot to be gleaned from understanding how tree response, how tree-specific response to drought scales to an entire catchment. But, I think it's also recognizing that climate change is here and it's here to stay, and that the impacts and these changing forests will continue their trajectory for the next 100 years. And so in 100 years, this forest, 100 years ago, this forest looked really different. And 100 years from now, this forest will look very different. And I think the question is, in these very different, futures, what happens to our water? And I think to some degree, we need to ask the more specific question of what happens to our forest. And that involves understanding transitions in species composition. I don't think that totally answers your question, but I do think that we don't know the value of it until we've kind of done some of the work.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And a lot of folks would just say that, the climate will be the dominant driver rather than the forest as the sort of the system through which it flows. But at the next larger scale up, the forest is the system that's driving the climate, right? And so I think you're totally right that we need to get those coupling correct. Let's see, any other questions from anyone? I think our students have jumped off to their next class already. And if so, no other questions. I see nothing else from YouTube. Anything, Matt?
I'd like this to go on for like another hour. I really enjoyed it, but I unfortunately have to get onto a Zoom that I'm 15 minutes late for.
Thanks for coming.
You know how that is, man. I'm like chain zooming today.
I know. It's unhealthy, but all right. Thank you.
Thanks for doing that. I was really excellent. I'm glad I was able to join.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, I'll stop the recording.
All right.
And before we, and now I'll stop this.